So please join me in welcoming Melanie Trede for our student lecture.
Thank you, Kevin, for an overly generous introduction. Yes. And thank you also, Kevin and Tommy Tonomura and Jonathan Zwicker for inviting me to be here as a Toyota visiting professor and to oblige, happily so, to present my research today. And thank you, Jane Ozanich, for organizing it all. What I'm presenting to you today is an outline of a book manuscript I'm currently trying to pull together. I hope for a lot of critique and input that will help me think the way I develop my ideas. It is in the spirit of a workshop presentation, rather than a finished and polished paper, that I respond to the wonderful opportunity to speak to a learned, informed, and lively audience of the Lunch Lecture Series, sponsored by CJS, which I'm privileged to have been part of since last semester. Before I start, though, I would like to commemorate my teacher, friend, and pioneering art historian Chino Kaori from Gakushuin University, who suddenly passed away exactly 10 years ago. She began her career as a specialist in early pictorial narratives and branched out to include feminist theories and contemporary politics vis-à-vis history and images, to name but a few. Without her role model and unwavering support, I wouldn't be here, and I may not have pursued the Hachiman research I'm presenting today. In 2007, a heavily mediatized scandal broke out at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. The display of the exhibition Telling Tales Illustrated Storytelling Scrolls included a hand scroll of the karmic origins of the Hachiman deity, dated to 1389. The parts of the scroll unrolled for display comprise the climax of the narrative, which is on the screen. It shows Empress Jingu, who fights against the Korean warriors in a dramatic sea battle, allegedly in the 3rd century CE. In a magisterial pose, this is her. In a magisterial pose, Empress Jingu is depicted with a strikingly white aristocratic complexion and is endowed with an auratic space surrounding her. She points with the top of her bow to a boulder addressing the kneeling Korean king in this case. The legend begins with an attack by the Korean kingdom Shilla and the ensuing death of her husband, Emperor Chuai. The pregnant Jingu sets out to complete her husband's mission and to conquer the 3 Korean kingdoms, Shilla, Paekche, and Koguryo. Aided by a number of deities, she succeeds and subjugates the Korean king. The reader learns in the calligraphed text following the scene on the left that Jingu will inscribe the sentence, here highlighted with the with a blue arrow. It starts here and runs up to there. The great king of the country of Shilla is the dog of Japan. The king subsequently vows to send annual tributes to Japan ever after. Upon Jingu's return to Japan, she gives birth to Emperor Ojin. On the right is the parturition hat representing this scene. Emperor Ojin later manifests himself as the great bodhisattva Hachiman. On the top left are Hachiman's miraculous appearances in the guise of a tripart stone-bodied deity, as a golden falcon, and as 8 banners, or Hachiman, this is his name, the 8 banners. These manifestations confirm Hachiman's close ties to the imperial household. The celebration of the main Hachiman shrines in Usa, in today's Oita prefecture, and of the Iwashimizu Hachiman shrine south of Kyoto conclude the second part of the scroll. The display of Jingu's victorious posture aroused the anger of the Korean media, the Korean American community in the Bay Area, and the Korean consulate. Yong Ki-ju, editor of the Korea Daily, wrote that the exhibit was, quote, problematic because it distorts the history of Korea's relationship with Japan. And the scroll, quote, the scroll's antiquity lends its contents historical weight, particularly for viewers unaware of Korea's past, unquote. He even called for a removal of the scroll from public viewing. The criticism was countered by the museum, which argued that the story was not historical and that exhibits do not necessarily reflect the beliefs of the museum staff. But comments by visitors confirmed that the viewers' opinions diverged from what the museum intended to show. As tendentious as this controversy may seem to some, it highlights problems regarding the relevance of history, the veracity of images, and the politics of museum display. The debate also exemplifies the impact of what the historian Timothy Garton Ash refers to as cultural reproduction. Cultural reproduction, so Garton Ash's assertion, cements stereotypes. In a review of the film The Life of Others, he quotes insights by cognitive scientists which demonstrate that, and I quote, "The repetition of words and images strengthens synapses that compute in our heads the meaning of those words and images. These mental associations become electrochemically hardwired," unquote. In other words, the more often text and images of the Hachiman and Empress Jingu legend are being copied, read, and looked at, the more immediately pre-existing connections related to Japan as a superior country protected by the deities are evoked. This observation on an individual level is developed on a broader level by cultural theorist Jan Assmann. Assmann refers to cultural memory as a long-term binding element among people belonging to the same community. In his book, Cultural Memory and Early Civilizations, translated into English in 2011, Assmann discusses the notion of cultural memory as a two-part mode. According to him, it consists of immovable recollections and storages of knowledge, such as the centuries-long predominance of Japan over Korea or the more recent occupation in the 20th century, while new information in the present adapt, change, or preserve this transmitted knowledge. One such present may be the exhibit of the Hachiman scroll and the reactions of museum visitors of Korean descent. Assmann's concept of cultural memory informs some of my larger questions addressed to the Hachiman legend as well. According to Assmann, cultural memory accumulates the kind of knowledge which draws a sharp line between those who belong and those who don't. It is a site of building, preserving, and reaffirming a group identity. Therefore, each time a Hachiman Engi is created, looked at, copied, and transmitted, the identity, again, of a superior Japan, protected by deities, is reconfirmed in the cultural memory against a subjugated, allegedly weaker Korean counterpart. It is precisely the political, devotional, and artistic significance of transmissions that moved me to investigate the long textual and visual history of the Hachiman legend. Why is it, one must ask, that this legend, first told in the early 8th century chronicles Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, was taken up as the stuff of illuminated hand scrolls in the 14th century? Why did the scrolls continue to be replicated and reformulated through the end of World War II? Why were some of the versions copied over and over again, while radically different and more embellished new types were created? Which are the turning points and ruptures, the presence, in Assmann's terms, which spurred a reinvention of this cultural memory that is the Hachiman legend? On the screen is the lineup of 4 Hachiman case studies which constitute the core of my manuscript. Each of them shows more or less the same scene of Jingu's subjugation of the Korean king or kings. Here it's just one king and attendants, whereas here it's Jingu and it's the 3 kings that are also mentioned in the text. And here it's again the 3 kings, right? I will briefly introduce these visual works and will then go into more detail, including some reflections on methodologies and the state of field before wrapping up, hopefully before 1 p.m. The earliest extant version on top dates to 1322 and is almost identical to the San Francisco version we saw earlier. This scroll, although itself a copy, is part of a first rupture in the history of the Hachiman legend. The second register, in other words this, it's just a detail of a very long scene, shows a detail of the scroll dated to 1433, which I regard as the second rupture. I call it an aesthetic turn in the history of the Hachiman legend. This term refers to the scroll's sophisticated visual reformulation, calligraphic refinement, and a remarkable colophon, or afterword, by the ruling Ashikaga shogun Yoshinori. That the sophistication of this scroll served other ends too will be discussed afterwards. On the bottom left is a scroll that dates to 1672, which marks a historiographic departure in Hachiman works. The scroll's known painter and its multiple calligraphers consciously refer to iconographic and textual models of the Muromachi period while celebrating new literary and visual inventions. The scroll's pioneering character is evident in the first depiction of Empress Jingu on horseback. You can hardly see her. She's here mounted, pointing her bow, right? So this pioneering character had a lasting impact, as we see in the last case study here. The images on the lower right comprise the earliest banknote printed for the Japanese treasury in New York in 1873. The bill depicts Empress Jingu on horseback in the sartorial attire of an European Amazon. Below is a stamp design featuring a portrait of Jingu dating to 1908. In this final chapter, I look into the discussions within the new Meiji government of how to unite a disparate people of the Japanese islands and how to visually represent the nascent nation-state vis-à-vis its foreign others. I focus on the creation of 3 different designs of banknotes featuring Empress Jingu issued between 1873 and 1883. Their political, visual, and social implications are set against a collective memory of Jingu's persona as it developed in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Department of the History of Art at the University of Michigan kindly invited me to present this research at the end of March, and I will therefore not dive into this material today, but I would be happy to answer any questions after my talk. So let's return to the first example of Hachiman hand scrolls. On the screen is the complete image on top and a detail of the battle scene, which shows the dragons emerging from the sea as they devour the Korean warriors. You just see like part of the body and the legs sticking out here, and this dragon is about to attack that one. This is a feature actually that pertains to the earlier versions and the earlier text, that the dragons do the dirty work for Jingu. The helmets and sartorial attire of the Korean warriors, which you see here best, unsurprisingly resemble depictions of the Mongolian invaders who had attacked Japan only 40 years prior to the scroll's creation. This work consists of 2 scrolls which were unknown until the Idemitsu Museum acquired them from an art dealer in 1987. The scrolls were restored and remounted, as you can glean from the exterior here. In the 1990s, they were mentioned briefly in a collection catalog of the Idemitsu Museum and also in a dictionary of Japanese hand scrolls. And in 2010, they were exhibited for the first time. But no substantial research has been conducted on these scrolls to date. The rupture or new feature of this work includes its redressing in a new format or media, a calligraphed hand scroll. The narrative text was excerpted and adapted and embellished with colored paintings. By doing so, the scribe and painter referred to the pictorial genre of comic origin scrolls, which reach back to the late 12th century. The bare text of the Hachiman legend was thus turned into an object of devotion, a temple treasure, and served as a tool to celebrate a new ritual center for Hachiman worship and to proselytize Hachiman belief. It is evident when reading the colophon that this version was the result of a larger copying practice in regional centers of Hachiman worship. The colophon begins by relating the arrival of a borrowed scroll from Harimanokuni, which is today's Hyogo prefecture around Kobe, in the 12th month of 1321. Both text and paintings were copied and dedicated in the 11th month, 1 year later in 1322. The borrowed scroll from Harima and its exact origins are unknown, but the striking similarity between the Idemitsu and the San Francisco version, which was created 67 years later, suggests that there was a large-scale borrowing and copying activity of Hachiman scrolls throughout the 14th century, covering a broad geographic space. On the screen is a comparison of the miraculous manifestations of Hachiman as a golden falcon, and the tripartite stone body deity, and as Hachiman, as you see. And I mean, this is obviously a copy. Maybe there's a copy in between, but there are, of course, also some stylistic differences if you look closely. It is evident when reading the colophon that this version was the result. Oh no, say that right. Sorry. Okay, colophon again. The colophon also discloses the devotional and proselytizing motivation of the scroll's creation. The scribe, painter, and donor, a certain monk Kakuzen, whose signature you see on the far left. This is Kakuzen. Gansu So. This is the monk Kakuzen, and here's the transcription. He wished that the scrolls be looked at by many people who would deepen their faith towards the deity and therefore cater to the appearance of Hachiman in the very shrine it was donated to. The devotionally motivated production and use of the scrolls is evident also in its writing style and paintings. The depicted motifs follow the text verbatim and acquire an iconic character that bespeaks its worshipping objective. The parturition hut in which Jingu gives birth to Ojin is a case in point. The painting shows only the hut with a cormorant feathered roof. So the roof bears cormorant feathers, and thereby there's allusion to other legends. And an enju tree, which Jingu holds onto during labor, and it conveniently branches kind of close to the hut so that she can actually hold onto it. Instead of rendering the pregnant Jingu and her entourage, the multi-angled hut is surrounded by an empty space, which suggests the aura of Jingu's and the newborn prince's presence. The text relates that this hut is the site of the earliest center of Hachiman rituals, the Usa shrine in today's Oita prefecture in Kyushu. Okay. We can come back to it. The choice of script types in the calligraphy of the text is another marker of the scroll's clerical origin and proselytizing function. The choice of script type on the screen is the beginning of the first scroll, which recounts the death of Jingu's husband Chuai and the empress's determination to quell the three Korean countries. The painting shows her departure from the palace in a palanquin, and this is the palace. This is she comes out of Rashomon, and this is her in the palanquin, and this is Sumiyoshi, the Sumiyoshi deity whom she encounters here. As you may recognize from the original or the transcription, reading aids in katakana syllables were added next to many Chinese characters. Look, for instance, at the very first line to the right. These reading aids help to decipher the text and pronounce the characters while reciting the text aloud. Right? This is here, for instance, here, but you also see it elsewhere. Additionally, the necessary syllables interspersed in the text are also written in katakana, as in the highlighted fourth line from the left and in the transcription. Right. Oh, I'm sorry, I just showed that. The katakana syllabary was employed as a technical tool to render and recite Buddhist sutras and their commentaries. Because they were used for oral presentation, they needed to be easily readable. The hiragana syllable, by contrast, was developed to render Japanese poetry in prose and lent itself to a more calligraphic and elegant writing style. Narrative hand scrolls representing Japanese subjects were therefore written in the combination of Chinese characters with hiragana syllables, a practice that was canonical in the cultural epicenter of the capital by the 13th century. Only few scrolls defy this principle, among them the early Hachiman scrolls. My interest in this work covers the following aspects. One is the large-scale political role of Hachiman scrolls which surface in the early 1300s. The upsurge of Hachiman scrolls production at that time, as we have seen in the Idemitsu and San Francisco versions, is intimately tied to the two Mongol attacks of 1274 and 1281. After these unprecedented and traumatic foreign assaults, Hachiman was among the deities credited to have warded off the alien aggressors, and as a result, his worship spread at a much faster pace and on a larger scale. Furthermore, I believe we need to integrate hand scrolls written with a mix of katakana syllabary in art historical narratives and find new ways to analyze their different visuality and materiality. Which are the tools to assess regionally significant scrolls created by non-professional scribes and painters, and how do we relate them to central productions of illuminated hand scrolls? One answer to the question of the relation between local productions and patronage by the social elite of Hachiman scrolls in the capital is given by the second case study. Dedicated by Ashikaga Yoshinori in 1433, painted by skilled professional painters, and brushed by a scribe well versed in elegant calligraphy, these scrolls clearly aimed at making a new statement for the history of Hachiman paintings. The explicit intent to set the scrolls apart from earlier and local productions is evident in several aspects. One of them is the colophon by Yoshinori on the lower right, which opens with an exclamation mark. You see here the blue arrows, right? Reading Shinzu, or Arata Nizusu, if you combine it into a red text, as the transcription has it, Arata Nizushite, meaning it's a new painting, newly copied. This is an unusual statement included in a colophon of a hand scroll to be dedicated to a deity. Another evidence of these scrolls' departure from earlier scrolls is the re-editing of the text, the elimination of repetitions, and ordering of the word-image sequence. And as you can glean from the first passage of the text on the upper right, the katakana majiri is exchanged for a hiragana majiri text. Although the beginning, and that's true of many engi, start with a lot of Chinese characters. But here you can see the o, and here you see the hiragana. Anyway, this is how the script types were chosen. All of these new aspects regarding the text comply with canonical hand scrolls of aristocratic patronage. Yoshinori's intent to reinvent the Hachiman scroll tradition is evident also in the paintings. The compositions fill the entire height of the picture plane, as opposed to the Idemitsu scroll, which you've seen. I mean, there are motifs and paintings all from top to bottom. Motifs that are not are supplemented, rich pigments are applied, and techniques such as the blowing of ink through a small tube are employed to render a storm or rain, right? So they put ink in, then they just blow it onto the painting surface to get that result of drops. And this very first scene of the first scroll demonstrates the pomp and circumstance that Yoshinori had his able but unidentified painters endow the scrolls with. This scene alone measures more than 7 meters, 2 meters more than the entire first scroll of the Idemitsu Museum. So the scene develops here, and the text is also much longer. It's just a little bit, otherwise it wouldn't fit. So it starts with staple motifs that usually introduce an imperial or aristocratic residence with, the attendants waiting with their ox carts, and one gate and another gate, and then more attendants and more attendants. And finally, you see here how 2 able warriors are commissioned to fight the foreign demon. And here you just see the red trousers lurking from beneath, the architecture that hint at Emperor Chuai, who holds a bow. I don't know whether you can see the bow, and is about to release the fatal arrow that is to kill the demon. And here we see the result. He's dead. His 8 heads are severed. And this, of course, is also dramatically kind of, composed. And you have to imagine, you have to unroll the scroll. You don't see the whole thing. You just see little by little from right to left, right? And then the result of this whole thing and the death of Emperor Chuai, which is not depicted, importantly so, is the emerging crowd of cavalry just behind the hill here, and then who follow Empress Jingu, who's in a much more stately palanquin, and is meeting. I mean, this is kind of a climactic cinematographic composition that really kind of focuses on their encounter, and Sumiyoshi right in the midst of the picture plane. Yoshinori's aesthetic turn in the history of the Hachiman legend can be further substantiated if we situate the Jingu scrolls within the unprecedented large-scale production of 4 sets of Hachiman scrolls, which Yoshinori dedicated on the very same day in 1433 to 3 different Hachiman shrines. They were the Usa and Iwashimizu Shrine, which we encountered already in the narrative, and the Konda Hachiman Shrine, where these scrolls are still kept. While the Usa and Iwashimizu Shrine scrolls have since vanished, the only other extant set of these scrolls belong to the Konda Hachiman Shrine, to which they were donated in 1433. On the screen is the climax of the first scene of this other set of scrolls, which eulogizes the imperial tumulus of Emperor Ojin, who is the earlier manifestation of Hachiman, right? So the first scene, this is the end of, again, a long scene, which shows the bedroom of the dying emperor. And you can see, again, a lot of pomp and circumstance with courtiers surrounding the closed-off space, and then women who are very elegantly dressed and kind of willowy figures kind of bow down to mourning and grief as they surround Ojin's bed. The set of 3 scrolls measure an extraordinary height for hand scrolls of more than 42 centimeters and features the unusual choice of silk as painting surface. There are only 3 pre-1600 scrolls that are painted on silk, and this is one of them. As Takagishi Akira convincingly argued, these unusual material selections point to Yoshinori's allusion to an earlier set of 2 scrolls dated to between 1309 and 1315. One of these sets is painted on paper and tells of the Chinese monk Xuanzang and his arduous journey to India, hence a story about dangerous and threatening foreign countries, just like the Jingu scrolls. The other set of scrolls was painted on silk and glorifies the karmic origins of the Kasuga deities. The Kasuga deities are the tutelary gods of the powerful Fujiwara family. The subject of these scrolls, therefore, resembles that of the Konda scrolls. Yoshinori's reference to these models, which eulogize the Fujiwara family, emphasizes his intent to elevate the Hachiman deity to the same level of this enduring aristocratic clan and the Kasuga deity. Since the 11th century, Hachiman was regarded as the ancestral deity of the Minamoto family, to which Yoshinori belonged and to which he was chosen as the leader. What we have then is the ulterior motivation of visually and materially promoting Hachiman from a locally worshipped deity to one that was visible in the power center of the 15th century. Yoshinori's intentions reach further than that, though. Among his reasons for this huge commission of hand scrolls may have been his gratitude to the Hachiman deity. In 1428, so this is 5 years before he donated these scrolls, Yoshinori was selected through an oracle by the Hachiman deity as the successor of his brother Yoshimochi, who died without an heir. Yoshinori may also have ordered the scrolls, therefore, to beg for divine support in producing a son who would continue his lineage. Or finally, he may have hoped that through this unprecedentedly opulent donation and the geographical spread of where he donated them to, the Hachiman deity would proffer military support to fight his rebellious cousin Mochioji in the Kanto region, which he finally managed to do six years later in 1439. Obviously, though, there were many reasons for Yoshinori to create these visually unparalleled Hachiman hand scrolls. In my mind, the shift from the earlier scrolls is clearly one from a proselytizing, devotional, and didactic object of instruction to one that was tantamount to a soliloquy between patron and deity for personal and power-related reasons. The significance of Yoshinori's aesthetic turn of Hachiman scrolls in 1433 also had art historical ramifications, resulting in a lively afterlife of these hand scrolls. In a digression from the main argument of historical adaptation and transmission of Hachiman hand scrolls, I analyzed the afterlives of both the Jingu and the Konda Hachiman scrolls in separate chapters. While I won't be able to dive deeper into these chapters today, suffice it to say that the repercussions of the scrolls can be divided into 4 categories, or I divide them in 4 categories. The first one is Jingu's afterlife, Jingu scroll's afterlife, is the significance as a devotional object that was worthy to be copied as a sacred text in the 16th and 17th centuries. Yoshinori's scrolls served as the model for 2 sets of hand scrolls dedicated to Hachiman shrines, among them the one on the screen, which is below, dated to 1535. They are stylistically different. We also know who painted them, and these were donated to the Tamukeyama Hachimango, which is part of the Todaiji temple in Nara, and the earlier one was given to a temple in Kyushu. The scrolls then turn into a model for professional painters who emulate the style, compositions, and coloring in order to expand their visual vocabulary. On the screen are snippets of copies from various old hand scrolls by the Sumiyoshi school of painters, among them a scene from the Kondo scroll. So what you see here, this guy, and here it actually says Kondano Engi, and here it has the attendance, and this is exactly the guy who's facing us, right? And this one in front, and you might recognize the signature and the kind of cipher of Yoshinori. Right. This category can be referred to as a type of artistic commodification, which limits the scroll to their tangible pictorial allure and ignores political implications. The third category is the popularized sacred treasure of the Kondo shrine, advertised for travelers and pilgrims in printed guidebooks beginning in the late 17th century. Here is the page in the guidebook to the Kawachi domain, enumerating the divine treasures of the Kondo shrine. The Jingu and Kondo scrolls are mentioned in the first line as the shrine's history, right? Tosha Denki. And then it continues on to give, of course, Ashikaga Yoshinori as the patron, and it also ascribes it to Tosa Mitsunobu, and we'll see in a minute where that comes from, and talks a little bit about the more recent history of that scroll in the temple. And finally, the scrolls are the subject of art historical evaluation and canonization. They were copied and assessed by famous painter Kano Tanyu in 1666, and he started the attribution to Tosa Mitsunobu, who wasn't even born when the scrolls were created. But this legend can continued well into the 20th century. So these early assessments are very important. The scrolls are finally designated as national treasure in 1910, the year of Japan's occupation of Korea, unsurprisingly, and were reproduced and introduced in an article in the important art journal Kokka, which you see on the screen. The publication date of 1938 and the selection of the subjugation scene, this is the introduction of the scene, and which then tapers into this very scene, which you by now, I think, recognize, underscore the political implications of the Hachiman legend. One more digression from the main argument is a discussion of the phenomenon of fragmentation of hand scrolls. As Yoshinori's colophon explains, he went on a pilgrimage to the shrine and saw earlier hand scrolls. This is where it goes on. He saw them. He saw the earlier hand scrolls, but judged that many things were careless, and the paintings were not perfect. He therefore supplemented the missing parts in a more appropriate new version. Right? This continues here. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first aesthetic judgment in a dedication of a narrative hand scroll. And I argue that it is this statement, as well as Yoshinori's social and political stature as patron and shogun of the Kondo scrolls, which resulted in the preservation and transmission of these scrolls until today. But the colophon also caused the ultimate disintegration and dispersal of the earlier version, dating to the 14th century, which he mentions in his colophon. And by the way, in the guidebook, this earlier version is not mentioned, so we don't even know whether it still was at the shrine at that time in the very early 19th century. On the screen is a juxtaposition of the two scrolls, the earlier version on top, 14th century probably, and then the Kondo version commissioned by Yoshinori, both depicting the construction of the Kondo tumulus in which the already dead Emperor Ujin was to be interred. On top, so you see this, it's exactly the same scene. You see here the peasants and people who come to construct the tumulus from all over the country, is what the text says, and here they are. Here a bit more elaborate. Then you see, of course, the kind of elevating tools of the aristocratic supervisors that are replicated from this very scene, and then this is the tumulus with its entrance showing already. And this is almost a literal copy, although the style, of course, is different. The widely diverging biographies of these two sets of hand scrolls also overturn the art historical notion of the older artwork, the more valuable, and they challenge the modern idea that an original is more valuable than a copy, because the original was cut up, if you call this an original. It was the earlier version, and only 6 fragments are known today, while the Kondo scrolls are restored and cared for, designated an important cultural property today. The final rupture in the history of Hachiman scrolls, now back to the argument of the transmission thing, is the set of 2 scrolls entitled Karmic Origins of the Hakozaki Hachiman Shrine. Brushed by 16 aristocratic scribes from the capital and painted by Sumiyoshi Guke, these hand scrolls were created for one of the ritual centers of Hachiman worship in Hakozaki, or today's Fukuoka city. The scrolls are dated to 1672, a time when the shrine was revived. Following donations from the local feudal lord, shrine buildings were reconstructed and a discontinued annual festival was reinstated. In 1995, the scrolls were introduced in a series of brief articles in a small art history journal, Bijutsukoge, and while they were included in few exhibitions of the Sumiyoshi school, the scrolls were always discussed within the framework of the Sumiyoshi painting school or 17th century Yamato-e paintings. Both the calligraph texts and the paintings demonstrate an historiographic consciousness that adapts and reformulates various earlier examples. At the same time, scribes and painters introduce contemporaneous interpretations and reinventions, as well as locally specific motifs. The adaptation of compositions of the earliest versions is evident in this scene depicting the manifestation of the 8 banners, descending on the upended pine tree, beneath which the sacred box of the 3 teachings, Kaijoe or Hako, is buried. And this is where the name Hakozaki comes from. This is the box. So it comes from the Hachiman Engi, basically. The iconic image of the banners facing the viewer in an almost anthropomorphic way, I mean, these are almost like legs, kind of thing like this. Where's that? Is obviously gleaned from the earlier Hachiman scroll versions. Kukai adds, however, the local aspect of Hakozaki Bay, which is just offshore of and facing the Korean peninsula, by adding waves towards the right and here. So this is the local, this is Hakozaki. You can't see that here, right? But because this is made for the Hakozaki, he had to be specific. Guke also drew on a version based on Yoshinori's 1433 scrolls, the rendering of Hachiman's appearance as a tripartite stone-bodied deity, on which a golden falcon emanates as soon as an imperial messenger comes, is gleaned from this composition, although it is different, in terms of spatial ordering and the amount of entourage given to the imperial messenger. It's clear that he must have seen this version or a copy of it. The final scene, supplemented to the scrolls, demonstrates the painter's thrust to localize the Hachiman legend and zoom in on the Hakozaki shrine. The shrine's precinct is depicted as a topographic but iconic and sacred map. Guke labeled each building, which is hard to see here, but these little things, these are all labels in ink. Here and there and so forth, so as to highlight the accuracy of its exact location within the temple compound. Although that's not quite true, because some buildings are depicted that didn't exist at that time and others weren't depicted that did exist. But still, this is the claim. His light-colored palette and typical airy haziness is new in the 17th century and adds spatial depth to the sacred landscape. Although individual buildings of temples or shrines are sometimes depicted at the end of Engi hand scrolls as an apotheosis of their karmic origins, none include a shrine's entire area and bird's eye view, such as in Gukei's Hakozaki scrolls. Among the scrolls' reinventions of Hachiman iconography is also the birthing scene. Far from the iconic rendering of the parturition hut in the 1322 version on the top right, or the peopled, stately elaboration, including seasonal references to the 12th month, as the text has it, in Yoshinori's 1433 scroll on the upper left, Guke composes a hands-on, approachable scene of giving birth. The spectator is granted an intimate view from above onto a rural setting. And if we follow from right to left, we see a female attendant giving the news of the birth to Jingu's main advisor, the allegedly 300-year-old Takeuchi no Sukune. And then here we have the ladies in waiting, and there's the little head of Ojin. You can see his little baby hair. It's very visible and tangible. You never see that in other versions. And then you see another attendant serving a Jingu who's probably closed in this kind of set apart by the mist, and the cormorant feathers are recognizable, serving her in there, and she herself is not visible. Gukei's rendering of the birth resonates with contemporary depictions in etiquette books for women as well. So 3 points summarize the 1672 Hakozaki Hachiman scroll's new aspects within the history of this legend's transmission. One was to offer a distinct adaptation of earlier Hachiman Engi scrolls so as to respond to the historical depth, the local specifics, and particular miraculous powers of the Hakozaki Hachiman shrine. Another was to translate the Kamakura and Muromachi models into a 17th century visuality that was easier to relate to for a larger contemporaneous audience. And finally, Gukei injected his artistic persona, which is not only manifest in his own signature and seal at the end of both hand scrolls, but also in his selection of motifs and stylistic choices, such as an emphasis of individual emotions in the figures and spatial representations in the landscape settings. In short, far from the usual art historical labeling of 17th century narrative painting as derivative, repetitive, and stereotyped, Gukei's creative reinventions in the Hakozaki scrolls exemplify a new trend in the Hachiman scroll history. And now the conclusion. There cannot be a conclusion to this workshop paper, but let me end with a few additional remarks. The reaction by visitors to the San Francisco exhibition showed that they feared people could read the hand scroll as representing history. Although the museum denies that the scroll represents historical events, it is a fact that up until the end of World War II, Empress Jingu's conquering of Korea and her demand of regular tributes was seen as Japan's historical past. Warlord Hideyoshi is known to have looked at a Hachiman Engi and to have given donations to Hachiman shrines in northern Kyushu before his disastrous invasions of the Korean peninsula in the 1590s. From the earliest history textbooks in the Meiji period onwards, Jingu's victory over Korea was included, and very often maps are added to show the scientific, truth of what happened. Yes, and Jingu was represented on banknotes and stamps through 1945 to represent Japan. The sudden disappearance of her persona from popular and official imagery after the Second World War likewise underscores the association of Jingu with nationalist rhetoric. To make use of the past to serve the present is a practice employed in different ways in each of the case studies I briefly introduced today. It is my argument that the idea of Japan as a divine country, the Shinkoku, protected by indigenous deities against foreign and internal threats, flourished because, among others, the Hachiman legend was so frequently copied and transmitted since the 14th century. The repetition of reading this text and looking at its paintings fortified monks and pilgrims, rulers and vassals, as well as ordinary people, to believe in their superiority vis-à-vis their Korean neighbors and by extension, other foreigners too. And now I look forward to your comments and thank you for your patience.